The morning mist clung to the mountains like a shroud when Marcus Chen received the call that would change everything. He sat in his small cabin, 30 miles from the nearest town, sipping black coffee and reading intelligence reports on his secure tablet. The phone's harsh ring cut through the silence like a blade. "Chen here," he answered, his voice calm despite the early hour. "Marcus, we have a situation." The voice belonged to Director Sarah Hawthorne, someone who never called unless the world was about to catch fire. "How fast can you get to the Cascade Range?" Marcus glanced at his watch. 6:45 in the morning. He'd been expecting this call for 3 days, ever since the reports started filtering in about strange activity in the remote wilderness areas, hikers disappearing, rescue teams finding empty camps with no signs of struggle. And now, apparently, something serious enough to wake him before dawn. "Depends on what you need me for," Marcus replied, already moving toward his gear closet. 20 years of covert operations had taught him to pack while talking. "We sent in a ranger team yesterday morning. Elite unit, 6 of our best people. They were investigating reports of an armed group establishing some kind of compound in the restricted wilderness zone." Hawthorne paused, and Marcus could hear papers rustling in the background. "Well, we lost contact with them 18 hours ago." Marcus pulled his tactical vest from the closet, checking the equipment automatically. Radio, medical kit, ammunition, emergency supplies, everything in its place, just as he'd left it after his last mission 6 months ago. He'd officially retired then, tired of the constant danger and the weight of decisions that kept him awake at night. "What kind of armed group?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The intelligence reports had been painting a picture for weeks of something bigger than random militants. "The kind that makes Rangers back away," Hawthorne said grimly. "We sent in a second team this morning for reconnaissance only. They made it to the Rangers' last known position and found their vehicles, all 6 trucks, abandoned in perfect formation. No signs of violence, no blood, no indication of where the team went." Marcus stopped packing for a moment. 6 Rangers didn't just vanish. These were people trained to survive in any environment, to handle any threat. If something had made them abandon their vehicles and disappear without a trace, it was serious enough to make his stomach tighten with concern. "The second team?" he prompted, pulled back immediately when they saw the situation. "Their team leader, Rodriguez, is a 15-year veteran. He's never backed down from anything." Hawthorne's voice carried a note of worry that made Marcus pay closer attention. He called in and said his exact words were, "Whatever happened here, we're not equipped for it. We need someone with different skills." We. Marcus finished packing his gear and shouldered the black tactical bag. He'd worked with Rodriguez twice before, both times in situations that would have terrified most people. If Rodriguez was backing away, the situation had moved far beyond normal parameters. "What do we know about this compound?" Marcus asked, walking toward his truck. "Satellite imagery shows approximately 30 structures, arranged in a defensive pattern. High-tech equipment visible on the rooftops, including what appears to be military-grade communication arrays and surveillance systems." The sound of typing came through the phone as Hawthorne accessed files. "But here's the strange part. The compound appeared seemingly overnight. Our last satellite pass of that area was 6 days ago. And there was nothing there." Marcus paused with his hand on the truck door. Building 30 structures in less than a week, in remote wilderness terrain, required resources and manpower that suggested something much larger than a typical extremist group. It suggested organization, funding, and planning on a scale that made his professional instincts start screaming warnings. "Who are we dealing with?" he asked. "That's what we need to find out. The area has been completely sealed off. But we're getting reports from neighboring regions of unusual activity. Unmarked helicopters, supply convoys using logging roads that haven't seen traffic in years, and electronic interference that's blocking most of our remote monitoring equipment." Marcus started the truck and began the drive toward the coordinates Hawthorne was transmitting to his GPS. The road wound through dense forest, and as he drove, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was heading into something unlike anything he'd faced before. His years of covert work had taken him into dangerous situations around the world, But something about this felt different, more calculated, more dangerous. "What's the official story if this goes public?" he asked. "Training exercise gone wrong, if we're lucky." "But Marcus, the reason I'm calling you specifically is because this doesn't feel like something we can handle through normal channels. Whatever group has established that compound, they've demonstrated capabilities that suggest significant resources and advanced planning. And if they've somehow neutralized 6 Rangers without leaving any evidence..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus understood what she was implying. This wasn't just about finding missing Rangers anymore. This was about determining whether a genuine threat to national security had established itself in their backyard. As he drove deeper into the mountains, the radio traffic on his scanner grew quieter. The normal chatter of Forest Service workers, local emergency services, and routine aircraft disappeared until only static filled the airwaves. Even his satellite phone began showing reduced signal strength, something that shouldn't have been possible in clear weather with unobstructed sky access. The interference was deliberate. Professional. Someone with serious electronic warfare capabilities was ensuring that the area remained isolated from outside communication. Marcus reached the staging area just as the sun broke fully over the mountain peaks. 3 government vehicles waited in a small clearing that served as an unofficial gathering point for search and rescue operations. Rodriguez stood beside a map table, pointing out locations to 2 other agents Marcus didn't recognize. "Chen," Rodriguez called out, relief evident in his voice. "Glad to see you." Marcus approached the table and studied the topographical map spread across its surface. Red markers indicated the last known positions of the missing Ranger team, while a large circle in black ink marked the approximate location of the compound. "Show me what you found," Marcus said. Rodriguez pointed to a spot on the map about 3 miles from their current location. The Rangers' vehicles were here, arranged in a standard defensive formation, keys still in the ignitions, equipment still secured, no signs of struggle or hasty departure. It was like they just walked away. "Any tracks?" "That's the strange part." One of the other agents spoke up, introducing himself as Thompson from the FBI's tactical unit. "We found tracks leading away from the vehicles, but they were too perfect. 6 sets of footprints, evenly spaced, walking in single file toward the compound. No deviation. No signs that anyone was being forced to walk. No indication of resistance." Marcus studied the map more carefully. The terrain between the Rangers' position and the compound was rough, filled with steep ravines and dense forest. It would take at least 2 hours to cover that distance on foot, assuming the travelers knew exactly where they were going. "Like they were being guided," he murmured. "That's what we thought," Rodriguez agreed. "But guided by what? And why would 6 experienced Rangers abandon their vehicles and equipment to walk 3 miles through difficult terrain toward an unknown target?" Marcus had seen enough unusual situations to know that the answer was probably simpler and more dangerous than it appeared. People didn't abandon vehicles and walk into wilderness unless they had no choice, or unless someone had convinced them it was the right decision. "What's the plan?" he asked. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. "That's the problem. We don't have one. The compound is too well positioned for a direct approach. Our communications equipment doesn't work properly within 2 miles of the area, and after finding those vehicles..." He gestured helplessly. "I've got 3 teams ready to go, but honestly, I don't know what we'd be sending them into." Marcus understood Rodriguez's hesitation. Sending more people into an unknown situation wasn't tactical thinking. It was a recipe for losing more personnel. But the longer they waited, the colder the trail became. If the Rangers were still alive, time was working against them. "I need to see the compound myself," Marcus said. "Close enough to assess the situation, far enough back to maintain operational security." "That's what I was hoping you'd say," Rodriguez replied. "But Chen, I have to tell you, this doesn't feel like anything we've dealt with before. My people are good, but whatever's out there spooked them badly enough that they're requesting reassignment rather than go back." Marcus nodded. Fear was a useful emotion when it kept people alive, but it could also paralyze decision-making when action was needed. He'd built his reputation on being willing to go places and do things that others couldn't or wouldn't do. This situation was exactly why people like him existed. "Give me 2 hours," he said. "I'll reconnaissance the area and report back with recommendations." As he prepared to leave, Marcus noticed the other agents watching him with expressions that mixed hope with doubt. They needed someone to take action, but they also seemed to understand that whatever was waiting in those mountains might be beyond conventional solutions. The forest grew denser as Marcus hiked toward the compound, following game trails and natural paths that kept him concealed while allowing steady progress. His years of training had taught him to move silently through any terrain, to observe without being observed, to gather intelligence without leaving traces of his presence. But as he got closer to the compound, Marcus began to notice things that made his trained instincts start screaming warnings. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no small animal movements, no normal sounds of a living ecosystem. It was as if every creature in the area had fled or gone into hiding. The silence was absolute, unnatural, and deeply unsettling. Marcus reached the ridgeline overlooking the compound just as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley below. What he saw through his high-powered binoculars made him understand why Rodriguez and his teams had backed away. The compound wasn't just a collection of hastily built structures. It was a sophisticated installation that represented months or years of planning and significant financial investment. 30 buildings arranged in concentric circles, with clear fields of fire between each ring. Communication towers that reached above the tree line, equipped with arrays that looked more advanced than anything he'd seen outside of major military installations. But it was the movement patterns that caught his attention. Through his scope, Marcus counted at least 40 people moving through the compound with military precision. They wore identical black tactical gear, moved in coordinated units, and carried weapons that appeared to be top-tier military hardware. This wasn't a group of militants playing soldier. These were professionals. As Marcus watched, a helicopter approached from the south, flying low to avoid radar detection. It landed in a clearing at the center of the compound, and 6 figures emerged from the aircraft. Even at this distance, Marcus could see they wore different uniforms, suggesting command authority. He activated his satellite communicator, hoping the signal would reach the staging area despite the electronic interference. Static filled his earpiece for several seconds before Rodriguez's voice came through, distorted but audible. "Chen, report. I'm looking at a professional military installation," Marcus said quietly. 40-plus personnel, advanced equipment, defensive positioning that would make a direct assault extremely costly. This isn't some extremist group setting up camp. This is a well-funded operation with serious backing. Any sign of our people? Marcus swept his binoculars across the compound again, looking for any indication of the missing Rangers. In the northern section, he spotted a building that was clearly different from the others, smaller, with no windows, and positioned away from the main activity areas. "Possible detention facility in the north quadrant," he reported. "Single building, isolated from other structures. If they're holding prisoners, that would be the logical location. Can you get closer?" Marcus studied the terrain between his position and the compound. Open ground for the last 200 yards, with no concealment. Multiple observation posts, positioned to provide overlapping coverage. Motion sensors visible on several trees. Getting close enough to gather detailed intelligence would require skills and equipment beyond what any normal reconnaissance team possessed. "Negative on closer approach during daylight," he said. "But I'm seeing something else that concerns me. Regular helicopter traffic, supply convoys, communication equipment that suggests they're coordinating with external groups. This compound might be just one part of a larger operation." Static crackled through the connection before Rodriguez's voice returned. "Chen, we just received word from headquarters. 3 other similar compounds have been identified in remote locations across the Pacific Northwest. All appeared within the last week. All showing similar characteristics to what you're describing." The implications hit Marcus immediately. This wasn't an isolated incident. Someone with significant resources and planning capabilities had simultaneously established multiple installations in strategic locations. The coordination required for such an operation suggested capabilities typically associated with foreign intelligence services or well-funded domestic terrorist organizations. "I need to get inside that compound," Marcus said. Absolutely not. Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. Chen, you're good. But those people down there have already demonstrated they can neutralize a 6-person ranger team without leaving traces. Going in alone would be suicide. Marcus understood Rodriguez's concern, but he also understood that conventional approaches weren't going to work. The compound's defensive positions, electronic countermeasures, and obvious military-level training meant that any standard law enforcement or military response would result in significant casualties. Meanwhile, the longer they waited, the more time the compound's occupants had to achieve whatever objectives had brought them there. I'm not talking about a direct assault, Marcus said. I'm talking about intelligence gathering. Find out who these people are, what they want, and whether our rangers are still alive. Without that information, any response is going to be operating blind. He spent the next hour studying the compound's layout, identifying patterns in the patrol schedules, noting the locations of surveillance equipment, and mapping potential approach routes. The people below were clearly professionals, but they were also human. That meant they had routines, blind spots, and limitations that could be exploited by someone with the right skills. As evening approached, Marcus noticed increased activity around the helicopter landing zone. Another aircraft arrived, this one larger, and carrying what appeared to be additional personnel. The new arrivals were escorted immediately to the central command building, suggesting they were either reinforcements or command personnel arriving for an important meeting. Rodriguez, are you monitoring this frequency? Marcus transmitted. Copy, Chen. I'm seeing increased activity that suggests something significant is happening tonight. Either they're preparing for an operation, or they're expecting some kind of action from us. Either way, this is probably our best opportunity to gather intelligence before the situation escalates. The radio remained silent for several seconds before Rodriguez responded. Chen, I have to tell you, I've been in contact with headquarters for the last 2 hours. There's serious discussion about declaring this area a no-fly zone and bringing in military assets for a coordinated response. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. A military response to a compound with unknown capabilities and possibly holding American prisoners was a recipe for disaster. Too many variables, too much potential for collateral damage, and too little intelligence about what they were actually dealing with. How much time do I have before they make that decision? He asked. Probably until morning. But Chen, if you're thinking about going in there alone, I'm thinking about doing what needs to be done, Marcus interrupted. These people have demonstrated they can make rangers disappear without a trace. They've established multiple installations without being detected. They have resources and capabilities that suggest serious backing. Waiting for a military response might be the safe option, but it's not necessarily the smart one. Marcus began making his way down from the ridgeline, using natural terrain features and approaching darkness to conceal his movement. The compound's external security was focused on preventing large-scale approaches, not detecting a single person with advanced infiltration training. As he got closer, Marcus could hear voices and mechanical sounds from within the compound. Generators humming, radio chatter in languages he couldn't immediately identify, and the distinctive sound of weapons being cleaned and maintained. These people were preparing for something, and the level of activity suggested it would happen soon. He reached the perimeter fence just as full darkness settled over the forest. The fence itself was standard security installation, but it was equipped with motion sensors and cameras that would detect any conventional approach. However, Marcus had spent years learning to defeat exactly these types of security measures. Using specialized equipment from his pack, he created a small gap in the sensor coverage and slipped through the fence without triggering any alarms. Once inside the compound, he moved carefully between buildings, staying in shadows and avoiding the patrol routes he'd observed from the ridgeline. The northern building he'd identified as a possible detention facility was exactly what he'd expected. Reinforced construction, no windows, single entrance with electronic locks, and positioned away from other activities to minimize the chance of prisoners being discovered by accident. But as Marcus approached the building, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. Voices from inside, speaking in clear English with American accents. Multiple voices, suggesting several people were being held inside. Day 3, And still no contact from outside, one voice was saying. Whatever these people are planning, they're being very careful to keep it isolated. Rodriguez will figure out what happened to us, another voice replied. But, in the meantime, we need to be ready for whatever comes next. Marcus recognized the voices as belonging to trained personnel, probably the missing Rangers. They were alive, alert, and apparently unharmed, but they were also clearly being held against their will, and the conversation suggested their captors had specific plans for them. Moving closer to the building, Marcus could hear more details of the conversation inside. The Rangers were discussing their observations of the compound, trying to piece together information about their captors' objectives and capabilities. They're not just random militants, one Ranger was saying. The equipment, the coordination, the way they operate. This is professional, military, or intelligence work. Agreed, another voice replied. And whatever they're planning, it requires keeping us alive for now. That suggests we're either going to be used as leverage, or they need information from us. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and concern. The Rangers were alive and thinking clearly. But they were also in a situation where their captors had specific uses for them. That could make a rescue operation more complicated, especially if the captors were prepared to use the Rangers as human shields. He activated his communicator, hoping to reach Rodriguez with an update. Static filled his earpiece for several seconds before a weak signal connected. Rodriguez. This is Chen. I've located our people. 6 Rangers, alive and being held in a detention facility within the compound. No signs of injury, but they're clearly prisoners. Outstanding news, Chen. Can you extract them? Marcus studied the building's security measures and the patrol patterns around it. The facility was designed to keep people in, not to prevent external rescue attempts. With the right approach and timing, it would be possible to get the Rangers out, but that would also alert the entire compound to his presence and potentially trigger a larger confrontation. Possible, but it would compromise any chance of gathering intelligence about what these people are actually planning, he replied. And based on what I'm seeing here, I think understanding their objectives might be more important than immediate extraction. Explain. Marcus looked around the compound, noting the sophisticated equipment, the level of organization, and the obvious investment of resources that had gone into establishing this installation. Rodriguez. This operation represents millions of dollars in equipment and planning. Nobody spends that kind of money just to hide in the forest. Whatever these people are planning, it's big enough to justify this level of investment. If we extract our people now, we might prevent them from getting the intelligence we need to understand what's really happening here. The radio remained silent for several seconds, while Rodriguez considered the implications. Chen, I understand what you're saying, but I can't authorize leaving American personnel in hostile hands while you conduct surveillance. I'm not asking you to authorize anything, Marcus replied. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. I'm going to find out what these people are planning, and then I'm going to extract our people and prevent whatever operation they're preparing for. Chen, that's insane. You're talking about taking on an entire compound by yourself. Marcus smiled grimly in the darkness. He'd been in situations before where conventional thinking suggested the odds were impossible, but he'd also learned that impossible odds sometimes created opportunities that wouldn't exist otherwise. Rodriguez, sometimes the only way to solve a problem is to be willing to do what everyone else thinks is impossible, he said. These people have demonstrated they can handle conventional law enforcement and military approaches. Maybe it's time to try something unconventional. Marcus spent the next hour moving through the compound, gathering intelligence and mapping the layout for what he knew would be the most challenging operation of his career. The people running this installation had made one critical mistake. They had prepared for conventional threats, not for a single operative willing to take risks that no reasonable person would consider. In the Central Command building, Marcus discovered the true scope of what he was dealing with. Through a window, he could see multiple computer screens displaying maps of major cities across the Pacific Northwest. Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, and several smaller population centers were marked with detailed targeting information. Communication equipment showed coordination with similar installations, confirming Rodriguez's report about multiple compounds. But what made Marcus's blood run cold was a timeline visible on one of the screens. Whatever operation these people were planning was scheduled to begin in less than 6 hours. The pre-dawn timing suggested they wanted to achieve maximum impact while minimizing the possibility of immediate response from law enforcement or military forces. As he watched, personnel moved through the command center with the focused energy of people executing final preparations for a major operation. Weapons were being distributed, vehicles were being fueled, and communication checks were being conducted with external teams. Marcus activated his communicator one final time, knowing this would likely be his last chance to update Rodriguez before taking action that would alert the entire compound to his presence. "Rodriguez, I need you to listen carefully," he transmitted. "This compound is the command center for a coordinated attack on multiple cities scheduled to begin at 0400 hours. Multiple installations are involved, and they have targeting information for major population centers." Static filled the channel before Rodriguez's voice came through. "Chen, are you certain about this information? I'm looking at their command screens right now. This isn't some isolated extremist group. This is a professional military operation with the capability to cause massive casualties. You need to alert every law enforcement agency and military installation in the region immediately. What about you and our rangers?" Marcus looked around the compound, assessing his options. 40-plus trained personnel, sophisticated security systems, and defensive positions that would make any conventional rescue attempt extremely costly. But they were also focused on their upcoming operation, which meant their attention was divided. "I'm going to prevent this operation from launching," Marcus said. "And I'm going to get our people out while I'm doing it." "Chen, that's impossible. You can't take on an entire compound by yourself." Marcus had heard that word many times throughout his career. Impossible. It was what people said when they couldn't imagine a solution within conventional parameters. But he had built his reputation on finding solutions that existed outside those parameters. "Rodriguez, remember what you taught me about impossible missions?" Marcus replied. "Sometimes the only way to win is to change the rules of engagement." He switched off the communicator and began implementing a plan that would either save dozens of civilian lives or get him killed in the next hour, probably both. Marcus's first target was the compound's communication center. Without the ability to coordinate with external teams, the planned operation would collapse before it could begin. The communication building was heavily guarded, but it was also essential to their mission, which meant disabling it would force them to focus on restoration rather than offensive operations. Using explosives from his pack, Marcus placed carefully calculated charges on the communication towers and power generation equipment. The explosions would need to be precisely timed to create maximum disruption, while giving him time to reach the detention facility before the compound's security forces could respond effectively. As he moved toward the detention building, Marcus noticed increased activity throughout the compound. Personnel were conducting final equipment checks, loading vehicles, and receiving what appeared to be last-minute briefings. The level of organization and preparation confirmed his assessment that this was a professional military operation with serious backing. He reached the detention facility just as the first charges detonated. The explosions lit up the night sky and immediately plunged large sections of the compound into darkness as the power grid failed. Emergency lighting kicked in seconds later. But the sudden loss of primary power had achieved exactly what Marcus had intended: chaos and confusion. The detention building's electronic locks had failed with the power loss, allowing Marcus to access the facility without triggering additional alarms. Inside, he found the 6 rangers secured in individual cells, alert and ready for action despite 3 days of captivity. "Rangers, time to go," Marcus announced, working quickly to release the manual locks that had engaged when the power failed. "Chen?" One of the rangers recognized his voice. "How did you get in here?" "Long story, short version. This compound is planning attacks on major cities in approximately 5 hours. We need to prevent that operation and extract before their security forces reorganize." The Rangers were professional enough to save their questions for later. Within 2 minutes, they were armed with equipment Marcus had appropriated from compound security stations and ready for action. But as they prepared to leave the detention facility, Marcus realized they faced a significant problem. The compound's security forces had responded to the explosions by establishing defensive positions around key facilities, including the detention building. Getting 6 people out without detection would be nearly impossible, especially since the Rangers had been prisoners for 3 days and weren't familiar with the compound's layout. "We're going to need a distraction," Marcus said, studying the movement patterns of security personnel through the building's observation ports. "What kind of distraction?" asked Sergeant Williams, the senior ranger. Marcus pointed toward the vehicle maintenance area where several trucks and helicopters were positioned for the planned operation. "Something that will make them think they're under attack from external forces, rather than dealing with an internal rescue operation." The Rangers understood immediately. If the compound's leadership believed they were facing an external assault, they would focus their resources on perimeter defense rather than internal security. That would create the confusion needed to extract successfully. "Give us 5 minutes to reach the vehicle area," Williams said. "Then create whatever chaos you think will work best." Marcus nodded and watched the Rangers move out, impressed by their ability to transition immediately from prisoners to operational personnel. Within minutes, they had reached the vehicle maintenance area and begun placing explosive charges on key equipment. As the Rangers worked, Marcus prepared his own contribution to the chaos. The compound's ammunition storage facility was positioned in the eastern section, far enough from other buildings to prevent accidental damage, but close enough to support rapid resupply during operations. Destroying that facility would not only create a spectacular distraction but would also prevent the planned attacks from proceeding even if some personnel managed to escape. The ammunition storage explosion exceeded even Marcus's expectations. The blast lit up the entire valley, created a mushroom cloud visible for miles, and sent shockwaves that shattered windows throughout the compound. More importantly, it created exactly the kind of chaos needed to mask the Rangers' extraction. In the confusion that followed, compound personnel assumed they were under attack by external forces and began implementing defensive procedures designed to repel a conventional assault. Security teams rushed toward the perimeter. Communication personnel tried desperately to re-establish contact with external installations, and command staff attempted to coordinate a response to what they believed was a coordinated military strike. Marcus and the Rangers used the confusion to move toward the compound's northern perimeter, where the terrain provided better concealment and multiple escape routes. But as they reached the fence line, Marcus realized they faced one final obstacle that could compromise the entire operation. 3 vehicles were approaching the compound from the south, carrying what appeared to be additional personnel or command staff arriving for the planned operation. If those vehicles reached the compound and provided reinforcement, the extraction could become significantly more difficult. "Williams," Marcus called to the senior ranger, "take your team and establish an overwatch position on that ridgeline. If anyone follows us out, you'll have clear fields of fire to discourage pursuit." "What about you?" Marcus looked toward the approaching vehicles, calculating timing and distance. "I'm going to make sure those reinforcements don't reach the compound." The vehicles were using the main access road, which meant they would have to navigate several hairpin turns through dense forest before reaching the compound. Marcus positioned himself at the most vulnerable point along that route, where the road crossed a narrow bridge over a steep ravine. As the lead vehicle approached the bridge, Marcus activated his final explosive charge. The blast brought down a massive tree across the roadway, blocking further progress and forcing the vehicles to stop in a position where their occupants couldn't effectively support the compound or pursue the extracting Rangers. But as Marcus prepared to withdraw from his position, he heard helicopter rotors approaching from the west. Another aircraft was attempting to reach the compound, probably carrying additional reinforcements or evacuating key personnel before the situation deteriorated further. The helicopter presented a problem that Marcus couldn't ignore. If it reached the compound, it could either provide the mobility needed to pursue the Rangers or evacuate personnel who might restart the planned operation from another location. Either outcome would compromise the success of the mission. Marcus had one remaining option, but it required getting close enough to the helicopter's landing zone to engage it with the weapons he'd appropriated from compound security. That meant moving back toward the compound, through an area that was now swarming with security personnel looking for whoever had just destroyed their operation. As he moved through the forest toward the landing zone, Marcus reflected on the irony of the situation. He'd spent 20 years avoiding impossible missions, and now he was voluntarily taking on odds that would make most people question his sanity. But sometimes impossible missions were the only ones worth doing. The helicopter touched down in the compound's central clearing just as Marcus reached a position that provided clear fields of fire. Through his scope, he could see personnel beginning to board the aircraft, confirming his assessment that this was an evacuation rather than reinforcement operation. Marcus's shot disabled the helicopter's tail rotor, creating immediate mechanical problems that would prevent takeoff. The aircraft settled back onto the landing zone, and personnel scattered toward defensive positions as they realized someone was engaging them from outside the compound. But the shot had also revealed Marcus's position to compound security forces, who immediately began converging on his location with overwhelming numbers. He had perhaps 2 minutes before they surrounded his position and eliminated any chance of escape. Marcus activated his emergency beacon, hoping Rodriguez would interpret the signal correctly and understand that the immediate threat had been neutralized, but extraction assistance would be welcome. Then he began moving toward the extraction point where the Rangers were waiting, using every technique he'd learned in 20 years of covert operations to stay ahead of the pursuing security forces. The forest was dark, difficult terrain that favored someone with advanced training over personnel more accustomed to operating in organized defensive positions. Marcus used that advantage to maintain distance from his pursuers while making steady progress toward the extraction point. He reached the ridgeline where the Rangers had established their overwatch position just as the first pursuit vehicles appeared on the access road below. The Rangers immediately engaged the vehicles with precise rifle fire, disabling engines and forcing personnel to abandon their pursuit and seek cover. "Chen," Williams called out. "We have clear fields of fire on anyone trying to follow us out of this valley. Time to go." As they moved away from the compound, Marcus looked back at the destruction they had left behind. Multiple fires burned throughout the installation. The communication towers lay in twisted wreckage, and the ammunition storage area continued to burn, with occasional secondary explosions. More importantly, whatever operation had been planned for the pre-dawn hours would not be happening. "Williams," Marcus said as they reached safety, "when Rodriguez asks you what happened here tonight, tell him sometimes the only way to handle an impossible situation is to be willing to do what everyone else thinks is impossible." The Rangers looked at him with expressions that mixed respect, amazement, and concern for his mental health. They had just witnessed a single operative neutralize a professional military installation and extract 6 prisoners against overwhelming odds. "Chen," Williams replied, "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what you just did." Marcus smiled as they continued moving away from the compound. "Williams, that's because most people are too smart to try what I just did." Behind them, the forest was illuminated by the fires that would burn for hours, marking the end of an operation that could have cost dozens of civilian lives. Sometimes the difference between success and disaster came down to one person's willingness to take risks that everyone else considered impossible. As they reached the staging area where Rodriguez and his teams waited, Marcus realized that he had found something he hadn't expected to find when he came out of retirement: confirmation that sometimes the impossible missions were exactly the ones that needed to be done by someone crazy enough to try them.